The Architecture of Numbness. Written by KX. Epigraph. There is no pain, only distance measured in waves. The child saw it once. The man built walls around it. Chapter 1. The First Quiet. He did not notice the change when it began. There was no thunderclap, no sharp division between who he had been and who he was becoming. The shift arrived softly, like dust settling on furniture in a room no one enters anymore. He continued to wake at the same hour. He continued to answer messages, to write in measured paragraphs, to speak with careful intelligence. Outwardly, nothing collapsed. Inwardly, something dimmed. It began with a thinning. Colors lost their depth. Morning light no longer spilled across the walls. It lay there, pale and indifferent. Sound seemed to travel a longer distance before reaching him, as if voices had to cross water. When people laughed, he understood the joke, but the laughter felt historical, something that happened a moment ago and no longer belonged to him. He told himself he was tired. Fatigue can imitate sorrow. Overwork can resemble despair. He had been thinking too much, writing too much, examining the architecture of pain in others until his own structure felt strained. Still, there was that silence inside him. Not peaceful, not meditative, vacant. As a child, he had known something brighter. He remembered standing in a narrow corridor of his family home, sunlight raking through a high window. Dust floated in the beam like suspended stars. For a moment, brief and inexplicable, he had felt aligned with the world. Not happy exactly, not triumphant, but connected, as though a hidden door had opened and allowed him to glimpse the machinery of meaning behind ordinary life. The moment vanished when he turned his head. He searched for it for years. He searched in books first. Philosophy, psychology, theology. He dissected arguments the way other men disassembled watches. He wanted to find the hinge that opened the hidden door. He wanted proof that the glimpse had not been an error of childhood imagination. Instead, he found explanations, diagnoses, theories about perception and memory. None of them returned the light. Adulthood arrived quietly, and with it came performance. He learned to speak well, to organize thought into clean, deliberate lines. People admired his clarity. They trusted his steadiness. He became known for composure, the ability to remain calm in rooms thick with uncertainty. Composure is a useful trait. It is also a mask. He discovered that if he spoke slowly enough, people mistook restraint for wisdom. If he remained still, they assumed depth. He cultivated this stillness carefully. It kept others from asking too many questions. It kept him from asking them of himself. The sadness did not feel like grief. There had been no death, no singular loss he could name. It felt instead like subtraction, as though something essential had been quietly removed and replaced with an outline. He would sit alone at night and press his fingers against his own wrist, feeling the pulse beneath the skin. The rhythm was steady, reliable, proof of life, yet he felt distant from it. He began to describe the sensation in private notes. Emotional latency, interior muting, response delay between event and feeling. He treated his own experience as material for study. If he could analyze it, he could control it. If he could define it, he could survive it. But analysis does not restore warmth. Sleep became an uneasy territory. He would drift into shallow dreams in which rooms extended beyond their natural dimensions. Hallways stretched without end. Doors multiplied along the walls, each one identical, each one closed. The air in these places felt stale, as if it had not been disturbed in years. He never opened the doors. He would wake before reaching them, heart steady, breath calm, the terror abstract rather than visceral. That frightened him more than panic would have. He wondered why nothing inside him rebelled. In conversation, he noticed subtle absences. A friend would confess something painful, and he would respond with appropriate words, sympathetic, thoughtful, composed. The friend would thank him. Sometimes they would say they felt understood. He did understand. He simply did not feel. There was a difference. He began to suspect that the mind could separate comprehension from experience, that empathy could survive even when emotion thinned into shadow. The realization filled him with a quiet dread. He returned often, in memory, to the corridor of childhood sunlight, to the dust suspended in brightness, to the feeling of standing at the edge of revelation. Now, when he tried to picture it, the light seemed weaker, the dust heavier, the window narrower. He feared that memory itself was fading. He feared something worse, that the moment had never been as luminous as he believed, that he had invented it to survive the growing cold of maturity. If the glimpse had been imaginary, then there was nothing to return to, only this. One evening, as rain pressed softly against the windows, he stood before the mirror in his darkened room. The reflection stared back with familiar features: tired eyes, composed mouth, the faint lines carved by years of careful expression. He searched for evidence of damage. There was none. That was the cruelty of it. Nothing visible had broken. He leaned closer to the glass. For a fleeting second, so brief he almost dismissed it, he sensed a delay, a hesitation between his movement and the reflection's response, as if the image were waiting for instruction. He stepped back, unsettled. The room felt smaller. Not physically smaller, but enclosed by something intangible. A pressure without source. He understood, then, with a clarity that did not comfort him. The change had not been an event. It had been construction, piece by piece, thought by thought, restraint by restraint. He had built an interior chamber where sensation could be reduced to echo. He had built it carefully. He had called it strength. Now it stood around him, silent and immense. And somewhere within its walls, the child who once saw the dust ignite in sunlight stood very still, waiting for a door that would not open again. He did not cry. He did not rage. He simply turned away from the mirror and sat in the dim room, listening to the rain fall against the glass, feeling the steady pulse in his wrist, aware, with a sadness too deep for tears, that he was still alive inside a space that no longer felt like his own. The quiet did not comfort him. It settled, and it stayed. Chapter 2, The Weight of Remaining. Morning did not arrive so much as it replaced the night. He opened his eyes to a ceiling washed in pale gray. The light had no warmth in it. It was the kind of light that reveals dust on shelves and faint cracks in plaster. The light of inventory, not renewal. He lay still for several minutes, listening to the muted sounds of the building. Pipes murmuring behind the walls. A distant door closing. Someone walking above him with unhurried steps. The world was functioning. The world was intact. He felt no urgency to join it. There had been a time when mornings carried anticipation. Even on difficult days, there had been motion inside him, a current that pulled him toward purpose. Now he felt anchored to the mattress, not by exhaustion, but by absence. Rising seemed theoretical, like describing the mechanics of standing without actually standing. Eventually, habit lifted him. Habit is stronger than hope. In the kitchen, he filled a kettle and watched the water tremble before boiling. Steam climbed into the air and vanished. He studied it carefully, as if it might demonstrate how disappearance works. He used to find comfort in small rituals: grinding coffee beans, opening a window to let in early air, reading a paragraph before speaking to anyone. These gestures once felt like quiet agreements with the day. Now, they were motions without conversation. He tasted the coffee. It was bitter. He registered the bitterness. It did not disturb him. It did not please him. It simply existed. He understood then that sorrow had matured into something steadier. It was no longer sharp enough to wound. It had become sediment, layered, compressed, ancient. He moved through his responsibilities with precision. He answered correspondence with thoughtful clarity. He revised sentences until they stood upright and defensible. He spoke to colleagues in tones calibrated for reassurance. No one suspected erosion. In meetings, he listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, people nodded. They described him as balanced, measured, insightful. He wondered when insight had begun to cost him sensation. There is a danger in understanding too much. When every emotion is examined, categorized, and interpreted, it loses some of its immediacy. He had trained himself to step outside experience and observe it from above. Observation creates distance. Distance becomes habit. Habit becomes character. By afternoon, a quiet heaviness settled behind his eyes. He stepped outside for air. The sky hung low and colorless, as though the world had been sketched but not filled in. Children passed him on the sidewalk, laughing without restraint. Their noise startled him. It felt foreign, almost intrusive, like bright paint thrown against a monochrome wall. He did not resent them. He envied the lack of calculation in their movement. As he walked, he tried to recall the last time he had laughed without self-awareness. Not a polite smile, not a measured chuckle, a laugh that bent the body and erased caution. He could not remember. Memory is merciful in some ways. It dulls pain. It also erases evidence of former joy. That evening, fatigue settled deeper than usual. He sat in a darkened room without turning on the lights. The outline of furniture blurred into shadow. Outside, traffic moved in slow pulses, red and white reflections sliding across the ceiling like distant signals. He felt as though he were seated inside a structure no one else could see. Not a prison. Not exactly. More like a vault built for preservation. He began to consider whether numbness was a form of protection. Perhaps something in him had concluded that intensity was unsustainable. The feeling deeply carried risk. That disappointment accumulates interest over time, and the debt becomes unbearable. If so, then the quiet inside him was not an accident. It was strategy, but strategy devised by what? He pressed his palms together and tried to sense warmth. His skin responded. Nerves fired. The body performed correctly. Yet the warmth did not travel inward. Later, he stood once more before the mirror. The face staring back appeared older in the dim light. Not physically aged, but altered by restraint. The eyes held knowledge without softness. He studied the reflection carefully. "I'm still here," he said aloud. The voice sounded composed, almost formal. The reflection answered perfectly in time. There was no delay tonight, no visible distortion. Still, he felt watched, not by another presence, but by a version of himself that had grown accustomed to control, a self that preferred equilibrium over truth. He understood something then, and the understanding carried neither comfort nor panic. He had mistaken silence for stability. In quieting his extremes, his joy, his grief, his anger, his longing, he had also quieted his capacity for astonishment. The world no longer wounded him, but it no longer astonished him either. There is wisdom in moderation. There is tragedy in excess moderation. He returned to the chair and sat in darkness for a long time. Rain began again, soft at first, then steady. The sound filled the room with gentle percussion. Years ago, rain would have stirred something tender in him, a memory, a desire, a melancholy with texture. Now it sounded like static. He imagined his interior life as a vast, abandoned theater. Seats covered in dust, curtains heavy and unmoving. A stage waiting for a performance that would not begin. The architecture remained intact. Only the audience had left. Near midnight, a thought emerged with unusual clarity. Perhaps nothing had been taken from him. Perhaps he had surrendered it gradually in exchange for safety. Each time he chose composure over vulnerability, distance over exposure, analysis over surrender, he had reinforced the walls of that interior vault. He had believed he was strengthening himself. He had been fortifying against pain. But fortresses keep out light as efficiently as they keep out harm. He felt a tremor of grief then, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real. A faint pulse beneath the layers of sediment. It frightened him more than emptiness had. Feeling, even faint feeling, meant risk. It meant that the vault was not perfectly sealed. He lay down without turning on the lamp. The darkness felt honest. It did not pretend to be anything else. As sleep approached, he understood that the true horror was not the sadness itself. It was the possibility that he might grow accustomed to it. That one day he would no longer remember that something vital had once moved freely inside him. That the quiet would become identity. And in that understanding, a single tear formed. Not dramatic, not theatrical, and slid unnoticed into the pillow. He did not wipe it away. He did not need to. For the first time in many weeks, the silence inside him was not empty. It was listening. Chapter 3. The architecture learns his name. He began to notice the precision of it. The emptiness was no longer vague. It had edges. It behaved consistently. It activated at predictable thresholds. Conflict, praise, memory, anticipation. The same interior dimmer switch lowered the lights each time. This was not chaos. This was design. He approached the realization with caution, as though studying a living organism that might respond to scrutiny. He had spent years analyzing systems, social structures, ideological frameworks, psychological defenses. Now he recognized similar patterns within himself. Input, processing, output. Stimulus, filtration, response. What disturbed him was not the existence of defense mechanisms. All minds construct them. What disturbed him was their elegance. He could feel disappointment approaching and, almost instantly, sense the internal reconfiguration. Expectation thinned. Hope recalibrated downward. Emotional investment withdrew to a safer perimeter. It was efficient. It was devastating. One afternoon, during a conversation that should have mattered, he experienced a peculiar clarity. A friend spoke of loss, a betrayal that had fractured trust. The story was raw, uneven, heavy with grief. He listened attentively. He nodded at the right moments. He offered words that were accurate and measured. Inside, he felt a faint echo of what should have been empathy. The echo did not deepen. Instead, a subtle detachment slid into place, like a pane of glass lowering between him and the scene. He could see the pane clearly. He could describe its contours, but did not touch him. He realized then that the mind can simulate compassion without surrendering to it. He wondered how long he had been performing care rather than experiencing it. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, considering the possibility that numbness was not the absence of feeling, but the suppression of amplitude. The emotional range had narrowed, but the signals remained faintly detectable, like distant radio frequencies drowned by static. He tried an experiment. He deliberately recalled a memory that once stirred him. The corridor of childhood sunlight, dust suspended in gold, the inexplicable alignment with meaning. He reconstructed the scene carefully, adding sensory detail. The texture of the floor beneath his bare feet, the smell of warm air, the distant hum of the house. For a moment, something flickered. Then the flicker was analyzed. He found himself dissecting the memory instead of inhabiting it. He evaluated its plausibility. He questioned its accuracy. He reduced it to neurological phenomena and developmental context. The feeling dissolved under examination. He sat upright in bed, unsettled. Wisdom, he realized, can become corrosive when it refuses mystery. Days passed in controlled equilibrium. He worked with increasing sharpness. Ideas formed cleanly. Arguments unfolded with disciplined structure. Colleagues praised his intellectual rigor. He felt a quiet irony. As his thinking grew more refined, his inner life grew more austere. Insight expanded, sensation contracted. He could articulate the mechanics of grief without being shaken by it. He could map the psychology of desire without feeling compelled by longing. It occurred to him that detachment is often mistaken for maturity. Society rewards those who appear untroubled. Calm is interpreted as strength. Emotional restraint is admired as wisdom. But there is a difference between integration and amputation. Integration preserves complexity. Amputation removes it. One evening, while reviewing old notebooks, he encountered earlier versions of himself in ink. The handwriting was less disciplined then. Sentences wandered. Questions were raw and unguarded. He read passages filled with urgency, reflections on beauty, terror, love, mortality. He had once written with hunger. Now he wrote with control. He closed the notebook slowly. The realization settled heavily. He had not simply grown older. He had edited himself. Each disappointment had tightened the prose of his personality. Each disillusionment had removed adjectives from his experience. He had revised his emotional vocabulary until only essential terms remained. Stable, functional, measured. He had mistaken minimalism for clarity. The mirror no longer startled him, but he continued to stand before it at night. There was no visible distortion now. The reflection moved precisely in time. The face was familiar, yet something in his gaze had shifted. He saw calculation where there had once been openness. He saw vigilance where there had once been curiosity. He spoke softly, testing the weight of his own voice. "What are you protecting?" The question lingered in the room. He considered possible answers. Humiliation, abandonment, failure, the unbearable intensity of hope. Hope, he thought, might be the most dangerous of all. Hope invites investment. Investment invites loss. Loss invites fracture. Numbness eliminates the sequence. It is an elegant solution. It is also a surrender. In the quiet hours before dawn, a deeper understanding emerged. The mind does not silence itself without reason. It responds to cumulative strain. Repeated disappointments teach the nervous system to conserve energy. Repeated exposure to unpredictability encourages withdrawal. He had not been attacked by some external force. He had adapted. The architecture within him had been constructed brick by brick through reasonable decisions. Be cautious, be composed, do not expect too much, remain steady. Each decision was defensible. Together, they formed a chamber where intensity could not survive. He rose before sunrise and opened the window. Cold air entered the room, sharp and undeniable. It stung his lungs. It made his eyes water. For a moment, the physical sensation cut through the haze. He felt present, anchored in his body rather than suspended above it. Pain, even mild pain, felt honest. He closed the window and sat beside it, breathing slowly. He understood then that wisdom without vulnerability becomes sterility. Intelligence without risk becomes isolation. Safety, when pursued relentlessly, becomes confinement. The sadness within him was not merely the loss of joy. It was the loss of danger. Without danger, there is no awe. Without awe, the world flattens. As the sky lightened from black to gray, he accepted something with sober clarity. The emptiness was not an enemy to defeat. It was a signal. It indicated where he had retreated too far, where caution had overreached, where analysis had devoured experience. The architecture inside him had learned his name because he had designed it. If it was to change, he would have to risk instability. He would have to allow feeling to exceed containment. He would have to endure the possibility of fracture without immediately reinforcing the walls. The thought frightened him, but beneath the fear, something else stirred. Not joy, not yet, but willingness. And in that willingness, faint as it was, the darkness shifted from absolute to porous. He remained seated in the growing light, aware that recovery would not be dramatic. There would be no sudden illumination, no triumphant return to the corridor of childhood wonder. There would be only small acts of exposure, small refusals to retreat, small permissions to feel. The sadness did not lift, but it deepened into something wiser, not merely the weight of absence, but the knowledge that he had been living behind careful constructions. And that knowledge, though heavy, was real. He chose to remain awake inside it. Chapter 4. The man who mastered the ruin. He stopped waiting for rescue. That was the first shift. There had been, beneath all the analysis and restraint, a quiet expectation that something external would intervene, a person, a revelation, a crisis dramatic enough to break the spell. He had imagined that transformation required spectacle. He was wrong. Nothing arrived. The days continued with mechanical obedience. The sky changed color. Emails accumulated. Deadlines approached and were met. Life persisted with professional indifference. He understood then that no one was coming to dismantle what he had built. If there was to be alteration, it would not be romantic. It would be deliberate. He began with disruption. Not reckless. Not theatrical. Precise. He allowed himself to disagree openly in a meeting where he would once have chosen diplomacy. His voice remained calm, but it carried steel. The room shifted. A few faces tightened. Someone blinked in surprise. He did not soften the edges. He felt the tremor of exposure in his chest, the old reflex urging him to retract, to smooth the surface. He did not retract. The discomfort lingered. It did not kill him. That mattered. Later, walking alone through the city at night, he noticed how darkness sharpened his senses. Streetlights carved bright islands into pavement. The air held the scent of rain and distant smoke. Music leaked from a bar doorway, low, rhythmic, alive. For months, he had drifted through environments like a spectator behind glass. Tonight, he felt the air press against his skin. It was not pleasant. It was vivid. There was a difference. He realized he had been chasing pleasantness, manageable emotional climates, predictable terrain. In doing so, he had exiled himself from intensity. Intensity does not negotiate. It confronts. He straightened his posture as he walked, not in arrogance, but in reclamation. If the world was going to bruise him, it would have to reach him first. He returned to the notebooks he had abandoned. Instead of revising them into clean arguments, he wrote without correction. Sentences ran long. Thoughts collided. Doubt appeared without apology. Anger surfaced, quiet but undeniable, at the years spent polishing himself into acceptability. He did not disguise the anger with theory. He let it exist. There was power in that. Not loud power, not spectacle, but ownership. He began to understand that wisdom without fire becomes compliance. Intelligence without defiance becomes servitude to expectations. He had been admired for his steadiness. He had nearly erased his edge. In conversation, he experimented with honesty. When someone asked how he was, he did not default to composure. He paused. He chose words that were accurate rather than strategic. "I have been distant," he said once, "from myself." The admission unsettled the listener. Good. Truth unsettles. He felt the old architecture strain under the weight of directness. Walls do not collapse quietly. They resist. He did not demand their collapse. He pressed against them. The mirror still waited for him at night. He stood before it again, not searching for distortion, but studying resolve. The face looking back was sharper now. Not harder, sharper. The eyes held calculation, yes, but also decision. He spoke clearly. You do not get to run this alone. He meant the defensive version of himself, the careful strategist who had prioritized safety over depth. The reflection did not smirk this time. It did not hesitate. It watched, and he watched back. There was a silent negotiation between them. He did not intend to destroy that part of himself. It had kept him alive. It had absorbed shocks he might not have survived otherwise. But it would no longer govern unchallenged. Integration requires confrontation. He began seeking sensation deliberately. Cold water against his face before dawn. Music played too loudly in an empty room. Long walks without headphones, allowing the noise of the city to enter unfiltered. He felt foolish at first. Then he felt something else, friction. Friction is evidence of contact. The sadness remained, but it was no longer sealed behind glass. It moved when he moved. It responded when provoked. He preferred this version of grief. It had teeth. One evening, rain struck the windows with force. Not the soft percussion of previous nights, but an assertive drumming. Thunder rolled across the sky, unapologetic. He stood at the window and did not retreat from the noise. He let the sound fill the room. There was a strange pride in remaining present during turbulence, a quiet swagger in refusing to anesthetize. He understood something essential. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is exposure chosen consciously. It is stepping into weather without pretending it is calm. He had mistaken numbness for resilience. Resilience bends. Numbness calcifies. He intended to bend. As the storm subsided, he felt no dramatic epiphany, no triumphant surge. What he felt was steadier, a grounded confidence. He could survive feeling. He could survive conflict. He could survive the risk of caring deeply again. The architecture inside him had not vanished. The chambers still existed. The corridors were still familiar. But doors had opened. Air moved differently. He sat in the aftermath of rain and recognized that strength is not the absence of fracture. It is the decision to live visibly despite it. The sadness had not disappeared. It had evolved. It was no longer a sealed vault. It was weight carried openly, and he carried it with his head lifted, not in denial of darkness, but in mastery of it. Chapter 5. The Room Without Corners. He began to sense that something was observing him, not in the crude, cinematic way of paranoia. There were no shadows shifting under doors, no footsteps pausing outside his apartment. The presence was subtler than that. It was structural, patterns repeated too cleanly. Thoughts resolved before he had fully formed them. Emotional surges flattened with suspicious efficiency. The system inside him, once defensive, now felt anticipatory, as if it knew his reactions before he experienced them. He had studied predictive models in other contexts. Algorithms learn from repetition. They refine outcomes by analyzing prior behavior. The mind does the same, but this felt accelerated. He would approach a feeling, irritation, longing, regret, and before it reached full shape, it dissolved into abstraction. As though an unseen editor had redlined the draft of his emotion and replaced it with commentary. He began to wonder whether he had trained himself too well. He dreamed of a room without corners. It was vast and circular, the walls smooth and pale, curving without interruption. There were no edges to anchor perspective, no shadows deep enough to conceal anything. The floor was polished to a faint sheen, reflecting his silhouette back at him in blurred duplication. There were no doors, no visible source of light, yet the room was illuminated evenly, mercilessly. He walked its circumference, fingertips grazing the wall. The surface felt warm, almost alive. When he pressed his ear against it, he heard a low hum, steady, mechanical, patient. In the center of the room stood a chair. It was his chair, the one from his apartment. He did not remember bringing it there. He did not remember entering. He understood, with dream logic certainty, that this room was not a prison. It was an optimization chamber. He woke with the taste of metal in his mouth. Morning light seeped around the curtains, thin and reluctant. He sat upright, pulse measured, mind already analyzing the dream. Circular architecture eliminates blind spots. Corners are where uncertainty gathers. Remove corners and nothing hides. He had been stripping ambiguity from his own psyche for years, interrogating impulses, naming fears, dismantling irrational hopes. He had pursued clarity as if it were salvation. Perhaps he had mistaken ambiguity for weakness. Perhaps mystery had been essential. He dressed slowly, aware that something in him had shifted again. The room without corners lingered in his mind, not as nightmare, but as warning. Throughout the day, he noticed an unsettling smoothness in his responses. A colleague criticized a recent project. He absorbed the critique without flinch. He adjusted his position calmly. He articulated improvements with almost preternatural ease. There was no spike of defensiveness, no sting, no heat. He felt efficient. He also felt edited. He remembered how years earlier criticism had ignited him, sometimes painfully, sometimes productively. That ignition had forced him to confront pride, insecurity, ambition. Now, feedback entered and was processed like data. Useful, impersonal, bloodless. He returned to his office and closed the door, unsettled not by the criticism, but by his lack of reaction to it. He missed friction. That evening, he turned off every light in the apartment. He wanted shadow. He wanted corners. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and allowed the darkness to accumulate. Gradually, shapes dissolved. Furniture lost definition. The room regained uncertainty. His breathing slowed. In the absence of visual clarity, sensation sharpened. He could hear the faint electrical current behind the outlets, the distant murmur of traffic, the soft movement of air through vents. He realized how long it had been since he had allowed himself to sit without purpose. No reading, no writing, no analysis, just presence. The first minutes were intolerable. Thoughts crowded in, demanding structure. He resisted the urge to categorize them. He let them remain disordered. It felt dangerous. Good. Memories surfaced without invitation. A conversation he had abandoned too quickly. A risk he had refused because it threatened equilibrium. A person he had kept at arm's length, not out of indifference, but out of fear that closeness would destabilize the careful system he had built. He saw now how often he had chosen smoothness over truth. He had told himself he was being wise. Perhaps he had been. But wisdom can become a shield so thick that nothing penetrates, not even love. The realization cut deeper than he expected. There it was. Pain. Not overwhelming. Not theatrical. Real. He did not analyze it. He endured it. Later, he stood again before the mirror, though he had not intended to. The glass reflected only darkness behind him. His face floated pale against the black. "You are not a machine," he said quietly. The words sounded almost absurd, yet necessary. He had treated himself as a system to refine, an apparatus to optimize. He had reduced complexity to efficiency. But human depth is not efficient. It is erratic, excessive, inconvenient. It is also alive. The reflection stared back without distortion. For the first time in months, he saw fatigue not as weakness, but as evidence of struggle. He saw sadness not as defect, but as testimony to longing. Something in his chest tightened. He welcomed it. That night, the circular room returned. This time, there was a crack along the curved wall, thin but visible. Light flickered through it, uneven and warm. He approached slowly. The hum behind the walls faltered just slightly. He placed his palm against the crack. The surface trembled. He understood, even within the dream, that perfection had been the threat. The seamlessness, the absence of rough edges. He pressed harder. The crack widened. The light beyond was not blinding. It was imperfect, pulsing, almost fragile. He had not stepped through. Not yet. But he remained there, hand against the fracture, listening to the hum destabilize. He woke before dawn with a clarity that felt earned. The architecture within him was intelligent. It had protected him with ruthless competence. It had eliminated volatility, reduced error, ensured survival. But survival is not the same as living. He sat on the edge of the bed, the room still dim, and understood that mystery must be permitted to return. Uncertainty must be tolerated. Emotional variance must be allowed to disrupt symmetry. Otherwise, he would become the room without corners, immaculate and uninhabitable. He rose, opened the curtains, and let uneven morning light spill across the walls. The shadows returned. They did not frighten him. They meant there was depth again. And depth, however dark, meant possibility. Chapter 6, The Frequency Beneath Silence. He began to hear it in the quiet. Not a voice, not language, a vibration. It lived beneath ordinary sound, under the refrigerator's hum, beneath the rhythm of his own breath, threaded through the distant movement of traffic. At first he mistook it for imagination, the mind inventing texture where none existed. But it persisted, a low, almost subsonic resonance. Continuous, patient. He did not panic. Panic would have been easier. Panic is dramatic. It gives shape to fear. This was subtler. The vibration did not intrude. It accompanied, as if something had tuned itself to him. He tried to locate its source. He unplugged appliances, turned off his phone, stood in the center of the apartment and listened. The sound remained, not in his ears, inside perception itself. He considered neurological explanations, stress responses, auditory hallucination. The brain, under prolonged tension, is capable of generating phantom signals. He cataloged possibilities the way he always had, carefully, methodically. Yet beneath the rational scaffolding was a darker hypothesis. What if the hum was not generated by him? What if it was activated by him? The days grew heavier, not chaotic. Heavy, as though gravity had increased slightly and only he had noticed. He moved more deliberately, conserving energy without consciously choosing to. Conversations required more intention. Eye contact felt charged, as if information passed through it in ways he could not decipher. He found himself studying people's faces for micro-delays, the slight lag between question and response, the fraction of a second where something unfiltered flickered before composure returned. He recognized the pattern. He had mastered that delay. Now he saw it everywhere. It unsettled him. How many of them were living inside rooms without corners? How many had optimized themselves into sterility? The thought did not comfort him. It deepened the loneliness. One evening, while walking through an underpass, he felt the vibration intensify. The tunnel amplified sound, footsteps, distant engines, the drip of water from concrete. The hum thickened, wrapping around him like invisible fabric. He stopped midway beneath the fluorescent lights. The air felt metallic. For a moment, brief but undeniable, he sensed alignment. Not with light, as in childhood, but with something darker, as though he had stepped into a current that had always been there, waiting for his internal frequency to match it. The realization struck him with chilling clarity. The architecture inside him had not only been defensive, it had been preparatory. He returned home and sat at his desk without turning on the lamp. The room rested in shadow, outlines softened, edges uncertain. He placed his hands flat against the wood and closed his eyes. The hum was clearer in darkness. He focused on it the way one might focus on a distant star, not directly, but peripherally. The vibration shifted, not louder, sharper. He felt it travel through memory, brushing against old decisions, abandoned impulses, restrained anger. It seemed to illuminate fault lines he had carefully paved over. He opened his eyes abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute, too absolute. In the days that followed, coincidences multiplied. He would think of a person he had not spoken to in years, and their name would appear in his inbox. He would question a long-buried choice, and within hours encountered an article addressing that very dilemma. He knew how pattern recognition works. The brain seeks connection even where none exists. But this felt curated, tailored, as if the world had begun responding to his internal adjustments. The swagger he had cultivated in recent weeks faltered. Confidence thrives on control. Control weakens when the system feels reciprocal. He dreamed again, not of the circular chamber, of a coastline at night. The ocean stretched black and endless beneath a moon obscured by thin clouds. Waves rolled in with hypnotic regularity, each one dissolving into foam before retreating. He stood at the edge of the water. The hum rose from the sea, not from beneath it, from within it. He stepped forward, allowing the cold surf to reach his ankles. The water did not chill him. It vibrated. He understood without being told. The ocean was not external. It was memory, vast, uncharted, layered with sediment and wreckage. He had skimmed its surface his entire life. Now, something was drawing him deeper. He woke with his heart steady and his sheets damp with sweat. He began to write differently. Not essays, not structured arguments. Fragments. Observations that refuse conclusion. Sentences that ended in silence. Questions without academic ambition. He wrote about resonance, about the cost of eliminating chaos, about the danger of mistaking stability for truth. The pages felt alive in his hands. Unfinished, he resisted the urge to refine them. He let them remain wild. One afternoon, while staring at his reflection in a darkened window, he felt it again, that faint misalignment between himself and his image. This time, the delay did not frighten him. It intrigued him. He moved slowly. The reflection followed, almost imperceptibly late. In that fraction of a second, he glimpsed something unfamiliar in his own gaze. Not emptiness, not control, depth. And beneath that depth, movement, as if the ocean had reached the glass. The sadness had not lifted. It had thickened into something older, more intelligent. He no longer experienced it as vacancy, but as pressure, the weight of submerged material rising toward recognition. He began to suspect that the hum was not a threat. It was a summons. The architecture within him had stabilized him long enough to survive. Now, it was dissolving in response to a different demand. Not comfort, not efficiency, integration. He stood at the window long after sunset, watching the city lights blur in rain. The vibration moved through him steadily. He did not attempt to silence it. He did not attempt to decode it. For the first time, he allowed mystery to remain unresolved. The darkness outside felt less like enclosure and more like depth. And somewhere beneath the surface of his controlled existence, something immense shifted position. Not hostile, not benevolent. Awake. Chapter 7. The Things That Watch Back. The vibration did not fade. It organized. What had once been a diffuse undercurrent now behaved with intention. It rose at specific hours, just before sleep, just after waking, during moments of stillness when the mind had not yet armored itself with language. He began to anticipate it. Anticipation is a form of intimacy. He stopped calling it a home. The word felt reductive. This was more complex, layered, almost harmonic. A structure of resonance rather than single tone. He wondered whether it had always been there, waiting beneath cognition like groundwater beneath stone. He wondered what had loosened the rock. He grew more observant in public. In cafes, he studied the posture of strangers, the way they held cups too tightly, the way their eyes flickered to their phones when silence approached. He watched couples sitting across from one another, speaking fluently, yet never fully arriving. Everyone appeared assembled. No one appeared unguarded. He felt a strange mixture of sorrow and superiority, not arrogance but awareness. He could see the seams now, the invisible scaffolding each person carried. He recognized it because he had lived inside his own. The insight did not comfort him. It isolated him further. Knowledge often does. One evening, while reviewing old photographs, he encountered a version of himself he barely recognized. The image was years old. He was standing outdoors, sunlight uneven across his face, eyes squinting against brightness. There was something reckless in his expression, not foolish, but uncontained. He studied that younger face for a long time. The man in the photograph had not yet mastered composure. He had not yet learned to anticipate disappointment before it arrived. There was risk in his posture. There was also hunger. He felt a sharp ache beneath his ribs. It was not nostalgia. It was recognition of distance. He had not simply matured. He had narrowed. The dreams shifted again. He found himself inside a library with no visible entrance. Shelves curved upward beyond sight, filled with volumes bound in dark leather. There were no titles on the spines. He approached one at random and opened it. The pages were blank. He turned another. Blank. Another. Blank. A quiet dread accumulated in his chest. He moved faster, pulling books from shelves, flipping through them, searching for ink, for narrative, for evidence of content. Nothing. Then he noticed something strange. The pages were not empty. They were reflective. Each sheet held a faint, distorted image of his face. Hundreds of versions of him stared back from every direction. Older, younger, composed, exhausted, defiant, hollow. The hum filled the library. Not loud, absolute. He woke before he could close the book. He stopped dismissing the experience as psychological debris. Of course it was psychological, but that did not make it trivial. The mind is not merely a processor of reality. It is an architect of it. When internal structures shift, perception shifts with them. He began to suspect that the vibration was not external intrusion. It was exposure, the removal of insulation.